Hello, everyone. This is the 185th episode of Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I interview Mr. Jan Roskott of the Dutch soccer site .org as we discuss Ajax Amsterdam's victory in the 1994-95 Champions League. Mr. Roskott has been on the podcast on multiple occasions discussing Dutch football history. Welcome back, Jan.
Thanks. Happy to be back. This is going to be an exciting one.
So let's go back in time, more than 30 years. What was the state of the affairs at Ajax in the fall of 1994?
Yeah, I think it was pretty hopeful, actually. I think the years before that were difficult. Ajax, for some weird reason, always had financial issues back then. You know, the 80s, they had the money laundering scandal, and some of the directors got into real trouble. I'm not really sure whether money was spent badly or whether the whole business model just didn't work, but they had some financial difficulties. In 91, I think Leo Beenhakker, who is a coach that we need to mention really in this podcast because he died less than a week ago, I believe, in Holland, in a sort of a sorry state. He was not well at the end of his life, and really because his body didn't want to do what his mind thought that he could still do. And but he was the coach for Ajax, and Louis van Gaal was his assistant back in the day. And when Leo got the invite to come to Madrid to manage Real Madrid, Ajax didn't have the money to get out into the open market and get a really good coach in. I think Johan Cruyff was the preferred option for the fans to come back to Amsterdam. But they pushed Louis van Gaal forward, and he wasn't popular back in the day. He was considered arrogant and difficult and obviously inexperienced because he never had a head coach appointment before that. He was the assistant for a short time at AZ Alkmaar, where he was booted out of the club. Not sure why, but probably because he was difficult. And then he was 2 or 3 years Leo's assistant. And there was a little bit of friction between them because Beenhakker is your typical old-fashioned coach, like go get him, guys. And Van Gaal is very, very tactical and very disciplined with the way that he dealt with the players. So there was a bit of a negativity. But when he took over, he won a European Cup fairly quickly with the likes of Dennis Bergkamp in the team. So everybody felt like, oh, okay, so apparently he is capable of winning trophies. The football improved, although Louis made some weird decisions. And I think that in the run up to 94, I don't know the exact dates and what have you, but there were a couple of key players in that team that Louis kicked out, like Jan Wouters, who was a force in midfield, probably didn't have the legs to play the style of football that Louis wanted. So Jan Wouters went to Bayern Munich, which is not a bad move to make, of course. Dennis Bergkamp, who was already considered from another planet in those days, moved to Inter Milan. And another public favorite, a fan favorite, Brian Roy, who was the left winger, very, very skilled, but very hard to coach. He was considered not too intelligent in terms of football intelligence. And Louis was very demanding, and he felt that Brian Roy just couldn't cope with his tactical instructions, so he moved him on as well. So there were a lot of question marks. Who's going to replace Dennis? How are we going to do this? And Wim Jonk, who came in from Volendam, was always seen as a bit as a softie compared to Jan Wouters. Although I think every player is considered a softie when you compare him with Jan Wouters. But yeah, so there were question marks. The young squad, not a lot of money. The good thing with Louis was that he always trusted the youth system at Ajax, and obviously he was the coach for what we call young Ajax now, the B team or the junior team. He was the coach, so players like Seedorf and Kluivert and Reiziger and even Litmanen played in that youth team. Louis knew them really well, so he had no problem bringing them into the fold for the first team. But the replacement for Dennis Bergkamp was a bit of a problem because they had a Danish player, and I'm not really sure. I think his name was Dan
Dan Peterson,
Peterson.
yeah.
Yeah, Yeah, with a D in not Peterson, but Peterson, I think it was. And he was a very gifted player, actually. He was Scandinavian. And there was a lot of Danish players, of course, at Ajax. So everybody felt like, yep, they've got another Danish gem. All great. He was quick. He was a good goal scorer. He had good technique. But he already got a pretty hefty injury early in the season, or maybe in the preseason even. I don't remember exactly. And then out of nowhere, Jari Liedmanen was pushed into the team as a number 10 from Finland, of all places. We never had a player from Finland anywhere, I don't think. So there were a lot of question marks about him. He had a bit of a typical gait and posture. He was always a bit hunched. I don't think he was the quickest in terms of speed. He had long black hair almost. He looked out of place a little bit. But boy, did we have a gem in him. He silenced the critics really, really quickly because he wasn't the quickest with his legs, but he was the quickest with his brains. So like Johan Cruyff always said in the past, you don't need to be the quickest, you need to think the quickest. And that's what Jari Liedmanen could do, of course. He scored goal after goal after goal, and always glorious goals. I've never seen him. Well, he had his tap-ins, but he scored incredible overhead kicks and lobs and chips and amazing goals. So incredible. And there's another name that we need to mention, by the way, Sean, which is a name that is usually never mentioned when this team is discussed, and that's Co Adriaanse, who has had a name for himself as a coach. Of course, later on, he became the head coach at Ajax. He won the title in Portugal with Porto. He was considered a very interesting coach, very attacking minded. He's famous for bringing Willem II from Tilburg into the Champions League. Can you believe it? And he was the academy director when Louis van Gaal was the head coach. And it's under his guidance that all these young talents were brought to the fore. And if someone deserves a statue, it's definitely him as well, I would say. Unsung hero.
We should mention that Wim Jonk was on the package deal with Dennis Bergkamp to
Mm.
Inter. Other players they sold in the interim were someone like Marciano Vink, who eventually would find his way to PSV Eindhoven, like many of those Ajax players. And in the meantime, Van Gaal had earned some credit by winning the UEFA Cup in his first season in 1992. And then the Dutch Cup in the following year, 1993, culminating with the league title in 1994, where that season Frank Rijkaard had returned home from AC Milan.
They were the proper invincibles, weren't they?
Yeah.
Because they didn't lose a game in the league, but also not in Europe. I don't think
Yes.
I don't think
Undefeated
Arsenal was
season.
able
Yeah.
to. Yeah, yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah.
But getting back to Louis van Gaal, he had had somewhat of an undistinguished playing career. His longest spell was at Sparta Rotterdam. What can you say about him as a player and then his transition into management?
I never felt that he had an how did you call it, an
Undistinguished playing career.
yeah, I didn't see it like that. At the time, Sparta Rotterdam was a sub-top team in Holland. They probably fought for European football every single season. They had one or two really great seasons in Europe as well. I mean, were never going to win a cup, but they could make it hard for the bigger teams. They had an amazing academy at Sparta, better than Feyenoord, who, of course, from the same city. But Sparta had way more attraction to talent from the region. And they had very good young players. And then they had three older players at a certain point. Louis van Gaal was one of them, of course. Dick Advocaat was another player in that team. Louis was the captain in midfield. He was literally the general. He had the armband, but he was the playmaker. He determined literally everything. I think there were coaches at Sparta in name, but I think it was Louis who decided who was playing next to him or behind him or in front of him. And I really, really loved seeing him play. He was formed at Ajax, as you probably know, in the youth system there. He's from Amsterdam. And I think he was considered the successor to Johan Cruyff at some point, which was quite interesting because they always seem to have that rivalry throughout their career. Because I think that Johan probably never saw Louis van Gaal as his real successor because Van Gaal was too slow. Johan was obviously quite quick. Van Gaal did not have the body and the movement of an athlete. He couldn't run. He always looked a little bit awkward, but he had amazing technique. He was a bit like Busquets at Barcelona. He was really good with passing, moving, the vision of the game, read the game. So yeah, he was a joy to watch. And I had a good friend playing in that Sparta team back then with Louis van Gaal. So I ended up watching them a lot live and also seeing some of their preseason games and what have you. So yeah, he was a good player. But because he wasn't quick enough, he never made it big. And back in the day, you had to play at Feyenoord, Ajax, or PSV to be considered for the national team. I think that Louis even had a couple of good years in Belgium with Antwerp. So yeah, I would say he was a very good player. He just wasn't good enough for the absolute top. But he was a coach when he played, so it was not a surprise for people that he would end up being a coach. The only question mark with him was he able to suppress his ego, because he was arrogant. He was very arrogant. He probably still is very very arrogant. So yeah, I can imagine that at certain places people would think, nah, we don't want him. Ajax didn't have much other options, so they pushed him forward, and they did recognize his coaching talent. And he was very good with young players, which is why it worked at Ajax. When he moved over to Barcelona later and had to deal with players like Rivaldo, who considered themselves top players already, he had issues with those kind of players. Like he had issues with Di Maria at Man United, and there's so many examples of Van Gaal clashing with players. And it would happen again at Ajax, of course, because the Boer brothers, they were almost like adopted children when they started at Ajax with him. They would ride with him in his car. They would carpool together, and they were really close. And later on, they would have quite some falling out situations with him. And it always came good again, of course. But yeah, Louis is a difficult dude, but he was really good to watch. Like Busquets, he never scored goals.
As we come to the summer of 1994 in this off season, let's discuss the transfer activity. As far as arrivals, you have Winston Bogarde from Sparta Rotterdam, a defender.
An attacker.
Oh, initially, you're right. You're right. My mistake. Yeah, that Chelsea fans will remember. You have backup goalkeeper Fred Grimm, who came from Cambuur. Michael Reitziger. He came back from his loan from Groningen along with Clyde Weinhard. Both of them from Groningen. They were on loan. And Michael Reitziger would be a key addition, as he would be the new right back replacing Sonny Siloy in the lineup. A certain Patrick Kluivert was promoted from the youth side, along with another youth player, Kiki Musampa. As far as the players who left, longtime goalkeeper Stanley Menzo joined PSV Eindhoven. Swedish veteran Stefan Pettersson rejoined IFK Gothenburg. Dan Pettersson, you're mentioning, he joined Monaco in France.
Hmm.
Andre Uyer, who would later become an international, I believe, with PSV, he joined Volendam. Same with Dries Busata, who joined Haarlem. I think Dries Busata also gained a cap with Rijkaard as manager of national team, if I'm not
That's
mistaken.
absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Gifted player, but probably more an indoor player than an outfield player.
And you have Michel Kriek, who never really settled in the side, and later in the season, he would be transferred to the Serie A at Padova. So not many big names as far as the signings, but these young players would make an impact for this new season. So how was the transfer activity looked upon at the time, if you remember?
Question marks. Yeah. It was clear that there wasn't a lot of money to bring big name players in. I think Bogarde, for instance, was not a great left winger. He never really impressed people when he was at Sparta, but he was tall, he was strong, he was a good header of the ball, and he was a bit of a warrior. So when Van Gaal signed him, it was quite clear very early in the whole process that he would turn him into a defender. And as a defender, he was obviously unbelievable. He was not always easy to work with. And even later on in his career, when he was an assistant coach at Ajax, they actually let him go because of some disciplinary issues with him. Not an easy guy to work with. But Reiziger as well. Reiziger in the youth system was a winger as well. So Louis started with, and I'm not sure if he was the first one to do it, probably not, but he did pick forwards to bring them back into the defense. Rijkaard obviously was always a midfielder in his younger days. He became a central defender. So yeah, it applies to quite a number of players. But everybody was a little bit frowning. They're going to gamble on youth. Patrick Kluivert was seen as, if you see Patrick Kluivert play when he was 18, 19 years old, he looks a little bit like a deer. He's very quick, but he's thin. He was a little bit vulnerable, you would say, when he had to play against Desailly, for instance. So a lot of people felt like, is he ever going to be a big name player? Because he's like a ballet player, like Van Basten was. But yeah, he shut us all up. Louis, he saw it really well. There's a couple of players that you mentioned. I'm not sure. Did you mention, you didn't mention Ulida yet, Tariq Ulida?
Tariq Ulida, yeah.
He
Well,
was already in the squad, I
yeah,
think.
yeah, he was.
Yeah, back in the day, I think Johan Cruyff actually said that he was probably the most gifted one of all of them. I remember seeing Edgar Davids for the first time when he replaced Brian Roy as a left winger. And I remember thinking, how on earth can they sell Brian Roy, who had all the balance and the elegance and the technique that you and the speed that you expect from a winger? And then there is Edgar Davids, who just didn't look like an Ajax player on the wing. And when Van Gaal pushed him more into the center of the pitch and more in midfield, you could definitely see what an incredible player he was. But on the wing, it just didn't work. So there's a lot of these things where Van Gaal saw something in a player that no one else saw, and he was able to transform them into those roles.
Let's take a look at the backbone of this 1994-95 Ajax side. In goal, we have Edwin van der Sar. Captain of the team, we have Danny Blind. We mentioned the De Boer brothers, Frank De Boer in defense, Ronald De Boer in midfield. You have Michael Reitziger, like we mentioned, he would take over the right back spot from Sonny Siloy, who would still remain member of the team and called upon when needed. And in midfield, you mentioned Edgar Davids, the pit bull,
Hmm.
Clarence Seedorf, the teenager, but already so experienced in the
An
team.
old soul.
Tarek Ulida, you mentioned. John Vandenbroek, who I believe he had come from Vitesse, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. He was a young talent when he was a really good player in his youth, but he really lacked speed and physicality to make it really big.
And you have the likes of another teenager, Nordin Wouter. You have Rob Alflen, who also never really featured that much. And also the young Martin Russer, who would
Yeah.
actually become an international later on. I think with again with Rijkaard. He may have gained one or two caps, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
Yeah. But
correct. Yeah,
after he
yeah.
left Ajax. Up front, you have the Nigerians, Finidi George, Nwankwo Kanu, another teenager, Yare Litmanen, you mentioned, Mark Overmars on the wing, obviously Patrick Kluivert, and also Peter Van Vossen, who had shown in the Belgian league with Beveren and Anderlecht. And he was signed for a big fee, but he never really fulfilled his potential at Ajax.
I don't think
And
he was a real Ajax player. He was probably more fitting with PSV, who were playing a 4-4-2 kind of system back in the day, and they would play compact and then counter-attack, and that was his strength. But he did have a really good relationship with Frank Rijkaard and with Louis van Gaal. So I think in the dressing room, he was an important guy. Interesting story about Peter van Vos. I'm not sure if you know this, but he's from a very religious family from the southwest of the Netherlands, which is very Protestant and very Puritan. And he was not supposed to play football on Sunday, which is why he was never picked up by a Dutch team when he was young. He had to go to Belgium to make a name for himself there. And then he started playing on Sunday. And of course, his family wasn't happy with him. And I don't know how that went exactly, but yeah, there was always a little bit of debate about that situation with him.
and he would eventually find his way to Rangers Glasgow. And then
And
back to
Feyenoord.
Feyenoord. Yeah, and Feyenoord as
Yeah,
well. Yeah.
yeah.
I remember, I think Patrick Kluivert in the Super Cup. I believe he scored twice against Feyenoord, if I'm not mistaken. And that was like the first introduction to Patrick Kluivert. Do you remember if there was a buzz about him already? What do you remember from his early appearances?
Yeah, I think that there was a buzz. He made a name for himself already in the youth system. Like I said, he had that Van Basten type quality. He was very light-footed, like a ballet dancer.
Yeah.
He was quick,
And
but he,
sorry to interrupt you, but there's that famous picture of him as a child with Van Basten. I'm sure you've
yeah,
seen that, right?
yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
I'm sure it
it's
was a
it's interesting.
mascot. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Oh.
right. There's a lot of those photos because a lot of the young talents were used as ball boys or as mascots, and they would then be on the photo with their big heroes. There's quite a number of them that I remember seeing in the past, and yeah, Kluivert is one of them. I think Seedorf and Rijkaard.
Yes,
when
yes.
Seedorf was little, and now later on they became teammates even. But Kluivert was definitely, and he was also a pretty boy, Kluivert, and he is always smiling. He had a really nice attitude and personality. So a lot of football fans thought, oh, this is potentially one of our greats in the future if his physicality can sustain this football. And then typically for Ajax, which is something I've never researched it, but Ajax is renowned in the Netherlands for bringing players in and having them score in their debut game. That happened to so many players, from Basten, Van Schip, Kluivert. I mean, I don't even know, but Van der Vaart later on, all the generations would bring special players in, and somehow they would score on their debut. And Kluivert was no stranger to that either. So yeah, I think we were all excited for the Dutch national team as well. I wasn't a big Ajax fan, so I wasn't really happy with Kluivert playing there, of course. But we all could see that he was probably going to be a national team player as well. And they had something interesting. They were very young. I think Ajax was the youngest Champions League winner in 95 when they won it, on average, with their ages. So we were all excited about seeing a young coach with young players playing amazing football. You couldn't help but applaud them and cheer for them, even if you were a PSV or a Feyenoord fan.
In the beginning of the season, was there a belief that Ajax might have the possibility to win the Champions League that season, or
No.
were they dismissed as a young team?
They were probably seen as a team that was going to gain a lot of experience playing AC Milan in the group stages, playing, some of those established big clubs in Europe. I don't think that anyone at that point felt like, oh, yeah, they're going to go all the way potentially. I think that feeling started after the second Milan game when they won in Italy. It wasn't in San Siro, as you may remember, because they had to play at a different in Trieste, I think it was. But that's when people started to say, wow, if you can beat AC Milan twice, you can probably beat any opponent. But from the start now, I don't think people thought that that was going to happen.
Well, they certainly made an impression on the first match. For their Champions League group, they were with the defending champions, AC Milan. This is the AC Milan of Ruud Gullit,
Yeah,
all the stars,
Baresi.
Baresi,
Yeah.
Maldini, Boban, Donadoni,
Oh,
Savicevic, uh,
what a team. What a team.
managed by the legendary Fabio Capello. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So this match, the first match, was on September 14th at Amsterdam's Olympic Stadion. Ajax made everyone take notice as they won 2-0 with Ronald de Boer scoring in the 51st minute and Jari Litmanen scoring in the 65th minute. They started the Champions League in impressive fashion. What was the general press and public reaction following this win, this first win over AC Milan?
Yeah, I think there was surprise, there was a positive sort of shock from, oh wow. Because what everybody felt was like, well, you don't have any pressure when you're Ajax with all those youngsters playing the huge AC Milan, the title holders. There's nothing to lose. Just go out there and play your football. And that's what they did. And Ajax, because of their Amsterdam background, I think, has always been a little bit cheeky in that sense and self-confident, and some people will say arrogant. There's a lot of self-awareness in that sense. They know how good they are, and they love taking the game, particularly to the bigger teams and the bigger players, and match them as far as they can. And that's exactly what happened in the first game. I think AC Milan, being the winners, going in the first team group stage, oh, we'll see how we go. They might have played at 90%, whereas Ajax was capable to play at 110, and that made all the difference. And we could see in that match, for instance, the quality of Jari Liedmanen, which is, I mentioned a couple of things about him, his vision, his intelligence, but he also had ice in his veins. If he had a chance, he wouldn't get flustered, he wouldn't panic, he would know exactly what to do with that. And Ronald de Boer, we mentioned Ronald de Boer now a couple of times. You probably remember that Leo Beenhakker actually sold him to FC
Yes, to
Twente.
Twente, yes.
Yeah, because Frank and Ronald, they're how do you call it? A single egg twin? Is that how you call it in
Identical
English?
twins.
Identical twin. In Holland, you would say a single egg twin. I think it's a weird expression, but yeah, the Frank and Ronald were pulled apart, if you like, by Leo Beenhakker. He didn't believe that Ronald de Boer was good enough as a striker. He lacked speed. As a midfielder, he lacked the work rate, if you like. He was almost like an indoor futsal player. He was incredibly skilled, but he just not good enough for any position on the pitch. So they sold him to Twente. And I think Van Gaal never agreed with that. So when he had the opportunity to bring him back, he did bring him back. And Ronald de Boer, of course, he is one of the most gifted players we ever had. So I remember watching the game, and my jaw fell on the ground when I saw them beating AC Milan. And I think we all looked at each other, going like, if this is really happening, then who knows what's possible?
2 weeks later, they had to face Greek side Ajax Athens
Oh yeah,
at Athens. They would fall behind to a Tony Savevsky goal in the 30th minute, but just minutes later, Jari Litmanen tied the match, and Patrick Kluivert would score the winner in the 63rd minute. That was 2 matches, 2 wins, and they seemed likely to qualify from this group.
that really gave them confidence as well, that away win. Because you do the math when you're a coach, but when you're a supporter as well, you want to win your home games. And if you also win an away game, you're in a really good position. So I think, yeah, that was a really, really good start for them. Oh, I have to say something about George, Finidi George, by the way. You mentioned his name. Did you know that there was a pre-season game where Van Gaal tested some players that he wanted to bring in? There was only a budget for one player, and he had the Russian Petrov, the Russian winger Petrov, Yuri Petrov. That was the key guy that they wanted to see in the game. And Finidi George was, well, let's watch him as well. And most of the Ajax players came off the pitch and were confident that Petrov was going to be signed. And Van Gaal said, no, I want the other guy. I want Finidi George. And Ronald de Boer in particular said, like, what? Why? We couldn't see it. But everybody knows now, of course, that it was the right choice.
Then there was the double clash against Austrian side Casino Salzburg. The first match was on October 19th at Vienna at Ernst Happel Stadion. That match ended as a scoreless tie. The next match was on November 2nd at Olympic Stadion at Amsterdam. This match ended as a 1-1 tie, and Ajax were actually losing going into the last 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Tomika Kosian had given Casino Salzburg the lead, but Ajax tied the match in the 85th minute through Jari Litmanen.
Who
So,
else?
so a couple of difficult matches. In retrospect, perhaps Ajax should have done better, but they were still in the lead in the group. They were in a comfortable position.
I
So
think Ajax in particular needed space to play their typical style of football. And I can't remember these games very well, in all honesty, but I have the feeling that Salzburg played a very what in those days was typical German football, compact, playing a bit on the counter. Whereas AC Milan, obviously, they like to play expansive football as well, just like Bayern Munich later on, and that gave Ajax opportunities to really tear them down. But they had some issues with breaking down opponents, and one of the reasons probably is Van Gaal got a lot of criticism later on in his career because he didn't allow his wingers to roam, where in the past there was that total football style where Johnny Rep would become the central striker or John van Schip would end up being the number 10 or whatever. Van Gaal was really adamant. Overmars, stick to the line. Finidi George, stick to the line. He almost as if you were playing a PlayStation game. And it worked in this season, of course. There's no criticism at all. But later on, it was clear that players needed a bit more freedom.
now we come to the fifth match in the group and the return fixture against AC Milan. Now, as you mentioned earlier, the match was not played in Milan but in Trieste, and that's because in Milan's previous one of their previous matches against Casino Salzburg, I believe a fan had thrown a water bottle and it hit the Austrian goalkeeper Otto Konrad. So AC Milan had to play their matches at away stadiums. And that benefited Ajax. And at Trieste, Ajax took the lead in the second minute through Jari
Yari again, eh?
Litmanen. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Van Vossen played in that game, by the way. Van Vossen started. Overmars was on the bench.
Yes, yes. And he'd be replaced by Kanu, in fact, in the first half. I think he might have been injured.
Yeah.
Ajax took the lead in the second minute, and in the second half, Franco Baresi scored an own goal when he diverted Finidi George's cross from the right side into his own net. That's a second win against the mighty AC Milan. Like you said, perhaps it was at this point that the observers felt that maybe Ajax could actually win the trophy.
First time they won against AC Milan, I think a lot of people felt like, oh yeah, but AC Milan didn't realize how good Ajax was. First game in the group stage, yada yada yada. But the second game in Italy, AC Milan are not going to be surprised anymore. They know exactly what to expect. And then of course this happened. So then a lot of people felt like, wow, are we actually that good? And well, we were. I say we, but I shouldn't say we. I had nothing to do with it.
Around this time, also, Patrick Kluivert makes his debut for the national team as well. Everything is seemingly good and positive for Ajax. They close out the group on December 7th at home at Olympic Stadion against Ajax Athens. And Tariq Ulida making a rare first team appearance. He scores a double.
I was there when they played that game in the Olympic Stadium. The Johan Cruyff Arena wasn't there yet, of course, in Amsterdam. The home base of Ajax was the Meer, which is a little bit like Craven Cottage, if you like. Wooden old stadium, enormous atmosphere, but not safe. And I don't think more than 20,000 people could get in. So they played their European games in the Olympic Stadium. And this was the beginning of the VIP boxes and all that stuff. And I happened to be in a position where I could sit in one of those VIP boxes because of the work that I did. And it was a glorious match to watch. And I was really happy to see Ulida play because, like I said, there was a lot of noise around him. People
Yeah.
saw him as an incredible talent. So yeah, I was really keen to see him play, and he scored twice in that game as well.
Unfortunately for him, like he never really made it at Ajax, and I think at the end of that season he joined Sevilla, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, he was a bit impatient, I think. And in those days, and I have to be careful with how I say this, I guess, but there was quite some stuff going on already behind the scenes between the colored players at Ajax and the Dutch players, and Ulida being Moroccan. In those days, Moroccan players had difficulty playing in the top in Holland because Moroccan culture is quite a bit different. To give you a typical example, a Moroccan player, you shouldn't criticize or attack him as a coach in front of the rest of the players. If you have something to say to him, do it privately. They've got a lot of pride, and if you would tell them off in the group, that they would take that really, really harshly for themselves. Where Dutch players and Dutch people in general are very direct, and they just tell you what they want to tell you in your face. So Louis van Gaal also was known to be not open to those cultural issues. He would just be Louis. I am who I am. I'm the boss. And if you don't like it, you can go somewhere else. And I think Olida didn't have the patience maybe to wait for his chance. The midfield was stacked tremendously, as you know, at Ajax with great players anyway. But I also think that culturally, Spain was probably a better country for him. And I think the main time of his careers was spent in Japan, if I'm not mistaken. I think he played a number of years there and was a big name player in Japan. And that's, of course, in the 90s, Japan was invisible. We had no idea what was going on there. It's still a little bit the case, I suppose. But there were no Japanese players back then in Europe. Maybe Shinji Ono was the only one maybe at Feyenoord. But that was later even.
That
That
was
wasn't in
later.
94.
Kazumiura, he had joined Genoa that season.
Oh, wow. And Honda was also later, I think.
I believe, yeah, yeah. I don't
Yeah.
remember when, yeah, yeah.
So anyway, that was Olida. Lovely player. Wonderful to check him out on YouTube if you can do that.
As we come to the midpoint of the season, Ajax are running away with the league title and are doing so well in Europe. How was their progress viewed back home?
That was the renaissance for Dutch football. I think that a lot of people felt like, oh, good, we can still play a part in Europe. Because back then the same thing happened as now. Since the 70s, it was hard for Dutch teams to really make it far into Europe. Obviously, 78, you had PSV Eindhoven. 87, I think Johan Cruyff got a European Cup with Ajax, but it wasn't like every year we were competing. It was probably every 6 or 7 years that we might get into the semifinals. But with all this talent on display, and with Louis van Gaal sort of being the new flag bearer for the Dutch coaches, we all felt that special things could happen. I also believe that the Dutch national team, the 92 Euros, were relatively successful. We reached the semis, 94 in the US. I didn't like that tournament much. I think we could have done better. But quarterfinals, a very tight game against Brazil, which we lost. Was there an offside goal? Yada, yada, yada. So most people in Holland were like, okay, 98, maybe our World Cup. There was a lot of positive atmosphere around football. And with reason, because Davids, Kluivert, Seedorf, Reiziger, Frank de Boer, an incredible lineup of talent.
We mentioned earlier that Patrick Kluivert earned his first cap. As we come to the year 1995, the national team is basically Ajax on block.
Mm,
And Edwin van der Sar becomes a starter. He's promoted to be the starter ahead of Ed de Hoy at this point. Everything seems to be going in Ajax's way. The only blemish in this otherwise magnificent season was when they were eliminated in the Dutch Cup, the Amstel Cup against Feyenoord, and that would be their only loss in the entire season. We come to the springtime and the quarterfinals. Ajax face Croatian side Hajduk Split. The first match is on March 1st at Split, and that ends in a scoreless tie. But on March 15th at Olympic Stadion, Ajax convincingly defeats Hajduk 3-0. Nwankwo Kanu scores in the 34th minute. Frank de Boer heads in a corner in the 43rd minute and scores from a free kick in the 67th minute. Ajax are through to the semifinals. For the semifinals, they're paired against Bayern Munich. Now, this Bayern Munich, they were missing Lothar Matthäus, who was injured. The team was managed by Giovanni Trapattoni. Even though Oliver Kahn was a goalkeeper, but he missed both of these matches against
that's
Bayern
right.
Munich. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So you still have the likes of Marcus Babbel, Thomas Helmer, the Swiss midfielder Alan Suter,
Dieter
Chris,
Hamann, I think.
yeah, Christian Ziege, Dietmar Hamann,
Mehmet
Alexander
Scholl.
Zickler, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and yeah,
Not a
Jean-Pierre,
bad team. Not a great team, I don't think, but not a
yeah,
bad team.
yeah, and Jean-Pierre Papin, who also missed these matches.
Oh, that's right. He was
Yeah,
there as well. Yeah, yeah.
but he was injured, I believe. He missed both of these matches. The first encounter is at Munich at Olympiastadion. Ajax comes away with a scoreless tie to have the edge for the second leg at home on April 19th. This would be like a signature statement by Ajax in a return fixture on April 19th as they defeated Bayern Munich 5-2. Jari Litmanen gave Ajax the lead in the 12th minute, but Bayern Munich actually tied the match through Marcel Vitecek. And at this point, due to the away goals rule, Bayern were actually ahead. But
Yeah, that's
just
right, of course.
but just before halftime, Ajax scores twice. Finidi George scores with a long range shot in the
Amazing goal. Yeah,
41st minute.
yeah.
In the 44th minute, Ronald de Boer scores the third goal. And at this point, it seemed like the match was more or less set for Ajax. And just after the restart, Litmanen scores his second goal. Ajax were through. Bayern pull a goal back through penalty kick in the 75th minute. But just before the end, in the 88th minute, Mark Overmars scores the fifth goal, and Ajax win 5-2 to reach the final.
It's
Yeah,
interesting. This was the game with Kluivert set out, I think, played
I
this game.
believe so. Yeah, I believe no, he came in the second half.
All right.
He replaced
Yeah,
Kanu. Yeah,
right. Second
yeah.
half. Yeah, yeah,
Both
yeah, yeah,
matches he replaced Kanu. Yeah, in the
yeah.
second half. And we have to mention that in this first season, I think Louis van Gaal was careful not to make him start every match because of his youth.
Yeah, oh, yeah, absolutely. Didn't
Oh,
start in the final either, didn't he?
no, no, that's right. That's right. Yeah, yeah. He replaced Litmanen, yeah, before scoring the goal, which we'll get to. For this final, they are meeting AC Milan for the third time, who had significantly improved in the second half of the season. And if you remember, in the semifinals, they had defeated Paris Saint-Germain. So they seem to be regaining their form. Now, given that they had already defeated them twice, was there belief that Ajax could win again, or was there some caution because of Milan's improvement?
Yeah, I think everybody felt like, wow, we've reached the finals now, but we should be just happy with that because we're going to play AC Milan for the third
Third.
time. We were able to beat them twice. Does lightning strike three times in a row? Yada, yada, yada. I think a lot of people felt like it's never going to happen. AC Milan has so much pride, but also so much quality that it's going to make, and they know how to play finals. We don't know how to play finals, really. So let's just enjoy it. But I have to
And
say something about these games, Shannon, because after the first game in the Olympic Stadium, the first match of the group stage, the players asked Frank Rijkaard, would you mind introducing us to the Milan players? Because we would love to exchange shirts with them. And that happened. Frank took the youngsters with them and they were, shaking hands and they were not asking for autographs, but they almost did, if you know what I'm saying. They were in awe of their Italian heroes. After the second game, when they won in Italy, it was almost the other way around. That the Milan players said, well, maybe we should ask their shirts now. But yeah, I think AC Milan felt like we are not going to lose again. But Ajax had so much bluster as a result of where they were that they themselves felt they could do it. Louis van Gaal was asked, would you rather play Paris Saint-Germain or AC Milan in the finals? And he said AC Milan. And they said, well, why? And he said, because Paris Saint-Germain parks the bus, and that's hard for us. AC Milan wants to play football, and so do we. So that's going to
yeah.
be an even game.
And in fact, Van Gaal himself had said that any team that's playing its fifth final in 7 seasons should be looked upon as the favorites.
Yeah, and rightfully so. And you mentioned the names in that team. They were unbelievable. But yes, so was Ajax. But I think a lot of people in Holland at that point in time didn't recognize that Seedorf, for instance, was going to be huge, or Overmars was going to be huge. Some of these players were still convincing the fans that they had what it took. Seedorf was always a bit ridiculed, even. Like you said, or like I said, he was an old soul. He was very mature in his presentation. He was very well educated, so he could give whole sentences as answers on questions from interviewers and everything. And a lot of people felt like, oh, he's a bit of a wise guy. There was a lot of, yeah, I don't know. Ajax fans adored all these guys, of course, but the non-Ajax football fans in Holland had a bit like, they're a little bit, yeah, arrogant. Amsterdam arrogance.
The final was set on May 24th at Vienna at Ernst-Hauptstadion. And it's Ajax against the mighty AC Milan. Perhaps Ajax were fortunate that Dejan Savicevic was injured at the last minute, and I believe Daniel Massaro started in his place.
Not the same kind of player, is he?
Yeah, he's just an out-and-out striker, Daniel Massaro, not a
Yeah,
or
yeah,
technical organizer like Savicevic.
yeah.
This match, we all know, Patrick Kluivert comes in the second half in the 69th minute, replacing Jari Litmanen. The former Milan player, Frank Rijkaard, in the 85th minute. He sent Kluivert through and he scored the winner.
Toe poke.
Ajax had defeated Milan for the third time in the season. They won their first Champions League in 22 years.
It's unbelievable if you think about it. I remember the game, but I remember it as not a very exciting game to watch. I think the Bayern Munich game, if you want to see that Ajax in full flow, watch that game. The game against Milan, the finals, was not a great game. And it was because AC Milan had a very good tactics to stop Ajax from being dangerous. But as a result, they sort of cancelled each other out. It was not a fantastic game. And I think in the second half, I think Rijkaard at halftime created something in the dressing room, which normally he wouldn't do. He never did that really, but he blamed his teammates for not being courageous enough, for being sloppy in possession, and for not daring too much. And I think that the younger players took offense. Ronald de Boer was one of them. He felt like, well, how can you say this? And then Danny Blind got involved as the captain. And it was I wouldn't say a bust up. It wasn't that bad, but there's a bit of shouting going on and a bit of blaming and a bit of getting everybody edgy. And Rijkaard actually played in a somewhat different position in the second half to get him on the ball a little bit more, which worked out, as you mentioned. He was the one with the assist. And what is also interesting to mention, I don't know if you know this, but Patrick Kluivert's mother felt like she was part of the Ajax machinery because she was bringing young Patrick to the club, on a daily basis almost from when he was 6 or 7 years old. So for 10 years, Winnie was her name, came to the club and talked to Louis van Gaal and to Leo Beenhakker when he was there and to Co Adriaanse as if she had a right to interfere with their plans. But she was on the plane going to Vienna and she said to Louis van Gaal infamous words, "Put my son in because he's going to score you the winner." And Louis van Gaal must have thought something like, "Shut up, just sit down, go away. You're not a coach here, I'm the coach." And obviously Patrick did score that winner. And after the game, she went up to Louis van Gaal and said, "See, I told you." That's fantastic.
Frank Rijkaard, let's remember this is his third Champions League, twice with AC Milan, and now with Ajax against AC Milan.
And this was the best one for him. He said
Yes.
it. Well, maybe he said that for the
And
fans, but
another image from this match that has become a famous meme is
I
Louis
know.
van Gaal jumping, imitating Marcel Desailly's kick.
I think
Yeah,
he had a point, to be honest. If you look back at the footage, he has a point. It was a very dangerous kick, and it should have been a free kick or a penalty. I can't remember exactly where it happened, but it was close to the box.
yeah. Well, it was dangerous. It was
It,
dangerous.
it was
I
dangerous.
think that's what Van Gaal was trying to get across. That it was a very
Exactly.
dangerous move.
Did you know that
So
he repeated it later in the Netherlands? Because it was a famous meme, as you say, and an image. So he was interviewed at a certain point, and I don't know exactly whether it was a week later or a year or whatever, but he was interviewed about it. Like, wow, Louis, you're whatever, 44 years old, and you're still so fit to do this. And he just did it again in a TV program. Yeah, crazy.
Ajax had won. It's amazing that this was the first Champions League since the great Ajax of Cruyff. They were back at the top with such a young team, and this is before Bosman. And I'm
Important
sure,
just
yeah,
to mention. Yeah.
I think some people were predicting that Ajax could potentially have more Champions
Yeah.
League wins in the future.
Yeah. They
But
came close though, didn't they, the next season?
yeah, but of course, Bosman would change everything. But more importantly, Frank Rijkaard was able to end his career at the end of that season. If I seem to remember, after this match, they still had to finish the league matches. I think they had maybe one or two league matches left, right? If I'm not
Yeah.
mistaken.
Yeah.
Yeah. Frank Rijkaard played in those matches and he retired in style. Ajax went through the season undefeated, winning 27 of their 34 league matches, and of course, all the Champions League matches.
Yeah.
So it was a dream season for the team.
I think it was a pretty good season for Feyenoord as well, if I'm not mistaken. They
Yes,
only
they won
won
the
the
cup. Yeah.
league.
Yeah. So in 95, Feyenoord won the Amstel Cup, the Dutch Cup. And I think that was Joseph Kiprich's last match, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. Yes. Of
Uh,
course. Yeah. The Wizard of Tatiana or something like that, they called him.
oh, yeah. Tatabanya. Yeah, that's where it's from. Yeah.
Tatabanya, that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Rijkaard, yeah, he ended his career there, didn't he?
Illustrious career, one of the best players in Europe of his generation, for sure. Getting back to Jari Litmanen, it was a rarity, like you said, for any player from Finland to establish themselves in a top team in Europe. How significant was that at that point?
Yeah, I think it was interesting because and a lot of kids in the Netherlands are called Jari as a result of his exploits in Holland. It was interesting because we did have Icelandic players in the 80s playing for Feyenoord, for instance, and being very successful. So there were those exotic places where players came from. And Jari Liedmanen did have a reputation when he came to Ajax already within the football world because he was seen as a tremendous ice hockey talent, actually. I think back in the day, people in Finland felt really bad about him picking football instead of ice hockey. It's the more important game in Finland. And he apparently was a better ice hockey player.
There's a very famous trivia about Jari Litmanen.
Is it?
Do you
Oh,
know
the
what it
fact
is?
that he kept on playing until he's 50th or something like
No, no.
that.
He played international football in 4 decades. Like I think he earned his
Right.
first cap in like 1989. So he played in the 90s, 2000s, and I think early
Unreal.
2010s. Yeah. So
Yeah, it's
that's a trivia
unreal.
question. Yeah.
It's really interesting. And he was very loved and still is in Holland because he's always been very grounded. There was nothing arrogant about him. He was just a very good human being as well. Always happy to talk about, whatever interviewer wanted to talk to him about. He was a great guy, grounded, as I said. But he was already a name because he had spells at Liverpool, I think at Barcelona.
Yeah.
He did a
Back
lot
to
of try.
Ajax.
Yeah, he had no, but before Ajax, I mean, when he was in the
No, no,
youth
he
system,
returned to Ajax. I mean,
yeah, he did return to Ajax.
yeah.
But before he started at Ajax, he had trials at Liverpool, at Barcelona. He was that guy that said to his parents, I want to be a pro football player and I want to go to the right club. So I'm going to do all these trial runs at all these different clubs in Europe to pick my favorite team to start my career, and he ended up in Amsterdam. And as you said, yeah, later on he went to all these great clubs again, Liverpool, Barca, and I am back to Ajax. Yeah, he was everybody's favorite player because of his skill, his goals, but also his personality. He's still an ambassador for Ajax. And there was an interesting clip the other day, actually last weekend, because we've got a player, a midfielder at FC Twente. Sam Stein is his name, and he has a similar sort of quality as Jari Liedmanen. He's 22 years old. He's actually the Golden Boot guy in Holland at the moment as a midfielder, scoring 20 plus goals, which is quite incredible. And someone said to him, "You remind everybody of Jari Liedmanen." And he said, "Who?" Jari Liedmanen, the Ajax player. And he's like, "Oh, I don't know exactly who that is." So they said, "Well, watch YouTube, go to YouTube and watch him play." Which he's done. So he said in an interview recently that he watched Jari Liedmanen, he could understand the similarity. And then Feyenoord swooped in just last week to get him in for next season. So next season he's a Feyenoord player. And he was not photographed, he was filmed at an Ajax game last weekend when he was watching Ajax Sparta. And Sparta is the team where his father is the head coach. So he was basically watching his father there, really, not Ajax. But who came down the stands to sit next to him? Jari Liedmanen, who happened to be in the Netherlands. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's really, really cool. Yeah, Jari is an amazing guy, I think. And he was very important for the team because of his work rate. He could do everything. And I think most of the players, like Rijkaard, obviously was extremely important. Danny Blind was 30 something, 34 maybe, 33. He started out as a left back at Ajax, was brought in by Johan Cruyff. A lot of fans didn't understand it. Why are we buying a left back? What are we doing? And he ended up a great partnership with Frank de Boer in the center of defense. A very intelligent player like Daley Blind, his son, same sort of football intelligence, I guess. He determined the pace. He was the playmaker, I would say.
At the end of that year, Michel Platini said that Danny Blind is just as important to Ajax as Baresi is to AC Milan.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair comparison. And Danny was able to score the winner for the World Cup that they won later on in Japan, or maybe it was the next year. I can't be sure, but they went on to win the World Cup in
Oh,
Tokyo.
against Grêmio, yeah. No, that
Yeah,
was
against
penalty
Grêmio.
kick, penalty kick shootout. Yeah,
He
yeah.
had the definitive penalty, which is nice for him. A game that they didn't want to play actually because it was mid-season. And the
And
only the
end of
only
November,
reason
yeah.
Yeah, the only reason they went was for commercial reasons, but yeah, they ended up winning it anyway. But 96 was a tough year because not only did they lose the finals, but also Patrick Kluivert got into a really
Oh,
sad
yeah, yeah,
situation
yeah. Of
where he
course.
I don't think he had a driver's license yet or something, but he was speeding in a BMW in Amsterdam, and he actually killed the
Right, right.
father of a friend of ours, believe it or not.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we didn't know until we met them and spoke about football, and she mentioned, "Oh, I don't want to talk about football because I don't want to hear the name of Patrick Kluivert. He killed my
Oh,
dad."
no.
And I
Yeah.
go, "Oh dear, I'm sorry to hear that." And Kluivert actually suffered mentally from that
Yeah,
a lot. I don't
probably.
think a lot
Yeah.
of people would know because he's always happy-go-lucky. He's always flamboyant and well-dressed, and he had this beautiful girlfriend and yada yada yada. But he apparently struggled enormously with the guilt of that situation, which you can understand.
Getting back to Blind and Frank Rijkaard again, they were the two old heads, the two veterans guiding a young team. So I imagine their contribution must have been significant that season.
Yeah, I think Van Vossen can be named in that group as well. Also, a little bit more experience. Van Vossen already had his massive period in the Netherlands team where he scored that penalty kick at Wembley,
93,
which
yeah.
which yeah, and he was a sub. He wasn't on the pitch for that long, so he has very mental strength. And Rijkaard with his experience. I think Blind was very important tactically. I think Blind was and is a real scholar of the game, a walking database. He hasn't been very successful as a head coach, but as an assistant coach, he's really revered for his knowledge. So I think Blind was more the actual football brain, and Rijkaard and Van Vossen were probably more in terms of mentality and ethos and consistency and what does it take to be a pro. And Rijkaard brought in not just his individual qualities, he also brought in that professionalism that he knew from AC Milan, where Milanello in those days was already considered the best training complex ever. And Ajax in those days was actually still a little bit of an amateur club in terms of facilities and professionalism. So Rijkaard had a big influence on the young players in that respect.
In a few years' time, many of these players ended up in the Italian Serie A or with Van Gaal at Barcelona or Ajax 2 as it was called.
Hmm.
How exceptional was this group?
I think you have to say that they were unreal. They were. It's just one of those generations that comes by every now and then, where they're all top players. The only thing I have to say is that particularly Jari Liedmanen, he did really well in a tactical setup like Ajax, where there's a lot of movement, a lot of football intelligence and skill around him, and an attacking team. I think he struggled in England and Liverpool, where the physicality of the game, the speed of the game is way different. Barcelona obviously plays like Ajax plays, you could say. So it was pretty normal for Overmars, I think, and for those kind of guys and the Kluivert to have a really good time there. But yeah, I think player for player, they were all tremendous. Seedorf, there's clips of Seedorf on YouTube that are just unbelievable. He scores for Real Madrid to scorch, was it Real Madrid or Milan? I can't remember, but two long distance strikes in one game that is just baffling.
And of course, another trivia about Seedorf that everyone knows.
The number of Champion League cups that he won for different clubs.
I think he's the only player to have won it with three different clubs.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, and I mean, Davids had a sensational career. I think Zidane, can't stop saying positive things about having Davids next to him in midfield at Juve. Yeah, I think they're all special players. Bogarde, maybe his career petered out a little bit, but he's a tremendous warrior, tremendous athlete. Reiziger, I think, was a bit of an underappreciated as a player. Well, he's the coach of young Orange now, and he was an assistant coach at Ajax, and everybody felt that he was the one that should have succeeded Erik ten Hag when Erik ten Hag left for Man United. But somehow Ajax passed him over, and he's now very successful as the young Orange coach. And I think people still see him as a very, very good coach potentially. But he was a very humble, soft-spoken guy. If Reiziger would have played at Feyenoord, he probably would have had a statue there. But because he was in a team with Kluivert and with Ronald de Boer and everything, he wasn't seen as one of the big boys. But Ronald de Boer, Frank de Boer, tremendous players. great mentality. Overmars was one of those players that did not have any fear, not have any mental pressure. He didn't care. He just did his thing. He knew his strength, which was obviously speed and a low center of gravity. Yeah, they all had something. They were a special generation.
This Ajax triumph was a rarity even for its day. Do you think it's nearly impossible to replicate these days?
I thought that for a long time, but then we saw in 2019 Erik ten Hag's
Oh
Ajax.
yeah, that was the closest they came. Yeah, but
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah. So then I think a lot of people felt like, hey, wait a minute. This is, of course, post Bosman. If we can still get to the semi, and I mean, they were in the finals until 1 minute before the end of the game, weren't they?
Few seconds
Uh,
before the
a few seconds, exactly right. So they could have been in the finals. Who knows what would have happened there? Because they would have played Liverpool, they probably wouldn't have had a chance. But still, it's proof that it still can happen. There was quite a special season as well, that season that Ajax played in 2019. And I think we're hoping that we can replicate it again. I think PSV Eindhoven, in terms of quality, is probably closest to being able to do it. This current Ajax is far, far removed. Even though they are probably going to win the title this season, the style of football under the current coach is purely getting results. Because you probably remember that last season they were last for a couple of weeks
yeah.
on the
Van
table.
Skipke became manager. Yeah.
Yeah, so they are clawing themselves out of that hole, and at this point in time, no one cares that the football isn't great because they all want to see them win something again. But next season, I think Farioli will either leave in summer or he will be told, okay, but we want to play Ajax football again because it's just it hurts your eyes to watch them play. PSV Eindhoven, I think, from a perspective of quality in the squad, are the absolute best team in Holland, but they completely dropped the ball. Probably a little bit of arrogance and lackluster performances. But if you look at their lineup, they are very good, and they could have gone further in the Champions League with a little bit more luck, I guess. But what's going to happen next season, you never know with Dutch clubs because when they do well, every other big team will swoop in and buy players.
In closing, how is this 1994-95 Ajax looked upon by Dutch football historians? What is its place in the Dutch culture as well?
Yeah, I think if you look back in history, then the three cups that Ajax won in the early 70s and this 94-95 Champions League win are considered the high points. And I think that the first three ones that we won was obviously total football, Johan Cruyff, Willem van Hanegem. Those were the key proponents, if you like. Rinus Michels for some people as well. And with 94-95, it's also the emergence of Louis van Gaal as a renowned coach with top quality. Obviously, the players we just mentioned as well. If you look at Feyenoord's 2002 UEFA Cup win, it was a tremendous season for the Feyenoord fans. But Bert van Marwijk was never as revered as Van Gaal would be. And most of the players in that Feyenoord team, except for Van Persie, but most of the players in that Feyenoord team have hero status outside of the fan base. I mean, the Feyenoord fans will revere Pierre van Hooijdonk forever, but in general, people see him as I wouldn't say one hit wonder, but he isn't. But he never made it big in the national team. There were always other strikers in front of him. But Van Marwijk went on to have a dreadful period in 2012 with the Dutch national team in the Euros. He was sacked at Dortmund, and then he ended up making a lot of money in the Middle East, coaching all sorts of non-football, historical football countries. So yeah, that career petered out a little bit. So yeah, I think that those are the high points. I think Feyenoord's win in 1970 under Ernst Happel is always considered the start of the Dutch football revolution, but not more than that. Which is a little bit unfair because I think that by now most people will realize that total football was actually developed by Ernst Happel more than Rinus Michels. Rinus Michels basically copied it because they played 4-4-2 Ajax before 1970. And it was Cruyff and Michels who watched Feyenoord play and said, "What? This is something that we should be able to do as well." And that's what became total football. But Ernst Happel probably deserves more credit for that.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview.
You're welcome.
And, and all our respective contact information is listed on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Jan, thank you once again for a very informative discussion and hope to continue these discussions on Dutch football history.
Looking forward to that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.